there's a real need for us to develop mutual mentorship across generations. And the mentorship is not always from old to young. It can go in both directions. But in the era of AI, where knowledge has become a commodity, maybe it's time for wisdom to make a comeback.
Hello, and welcome to FranklinCovey on Leadership. I'm your host, Will Hodling, FranklinCovey's head of product. In these conversations, we speak with many of the world's greatest leaders about the mistakes, methods, and mindsets that led them to become the people they are today. We hope their hard-earned insights and wisdom accelerate you on your leadership journey. Today's guest is Chip Conley, a hospitality industry disruptor, as the founder of Joie de Vie Hotels and the former head of global hospitality and strategy at Airbnb. More recently, Chip has founded the Modern Elder Academy, the world's first midlife wisdom school. Chip is also a prolific author. He's the New York Times best-selling writer of 7 books, including the most recently published Learning to Love Midlife. Chip is an incredible storyteller, an inspiring leader. He's spoken on the main stage at TED 3 times, including the 2023 talk on the midlife chrysalis. In today's conversation, we'll touch on his motivation for starting Joie de Vie Hospitality at age 26, the journey moving over to Airbnb after he sold his boutique hotel chain, what he learned working with founder Brian Chesky, the motivation behind beginning the first Modern Elder Academy, and much, much more. We hope you enjoyed today's spirited discussion. Chip Conley, welcome to FranklinCovey on Leadership.
It's an honor to be here, Will. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. We're very excited for today's conversation. So you have had an illustrious career, and I really want today to break it into 3 chapters. First is the Joie de Vie chapter, second, your Airbnb chapter, and now your Modern Elder Academy chapter. So to start with kind of where your career began, you graduated Stanford's Graduate School of Business, very young and impressive at 24. You went to work in real estate, and you've said that you became disillusioned with real estate after a couple of years, and that sparked the excitement to build Joie de Vie. Maybe tell me, was there a moment, or what was that disillusionment like that encouraged you and motivated you to start this boutique hotel chain?
Well, I think I expected the commercial real estate development business to be more creative, especially in San Francisco, where I was based. It was really much more transactional. It was like, okay, let's out negotiate our competitor here on this or that. And I wanted something more creative. I was lucky enough to be in a place, San Francisco, where boutique hotels were just starting to get off the ground, with Bill Kimpton being based there and Ian Schrager being based in New York. Those were the 2 sort of godfathers of the business. And I was sort of like the court jester of the boutique hotel business at age 26 when I called my company Joie de Vivre and bought an old broken down motel in the Tenderloin of San Francisco. And that was the first of 52 hotels that we created over the course of the next 24 years.
Amazing. So I've lived in San Francisco now for 17 years. I've been to that hotel multiple times, been to the restaurant as a resident, have it stayed. Why was that your first property? For those who are not familiar with San Francisco, the Tenderloin is an area downtown that is rough, to say the least. It is not where you would expect a kind of fancy, cool boutique hotel to be.
Well, it's definitely not fancy, but it is cool. And I didn't have any money, so if you're like you just turned 26 and you don't have much money, and I raised $1.1 million, $800,000 to buy the place. Which, can you believe that? And buying a 44-room motel on an acre of land for $800,000 ago. This is a long time ago, and we renovated it for $200,000.
Wow.
And I had $100,000.
Were you painting a lot of walls yourself?
Oh my God!
I just renovated a kitchen and
I would
44-room motel.
I would put a keg in the courtyard, and every weekend I'd invite my friends over to paint it pink and turquoise. So long story short is, that it was all I could afford. I also had a conversation with a guy named Bill Graham, famous concert promoter based in San Francisco, who said, Chip, what San Francisco really needs is a rock and roll hotel where all the bands stay. And that's really how it got started, as a musician and artist hotel.
I've heard legendary stories about the parties and the events and activities, so I'm jealous that it was before my era here. In the dot-com bust and kind of post 9/11 downturn, Joie de Vie really struggled. And I read that you had 22 capital calls, which is incredible. Can you tell me about that struggle and kind of how did you make it through? What got you?
Yeah, I wrote a book about this called Peak: How Great Companies Get Their Mojo from Maslow, based upon the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs applied to companies. And what we were going through was, just a seismic reduction in revenues in our industry, especially in the Bay Area. And what really got me through it was understanding human needs and what are the human needs of our employees. And they have some basic needs: money, compensation, and job security. But once you get past those basic needs, the next need, maybe the success need, is recognition. And then at the top of the pyramid was this idea of meaning. How do you create meaning for employees? So what we did is we invested a lot in culture, and we created an environment in which everybody felt they had job security. If they were doing their job well, they were not going to be laid off for economic reasons. And that made a big difference because it was our culture that had a huge impact on helping us get through that rough time. And in fact, 75% of our hotels gained market share during that time. So even though the market fell apart, we did better than the market. And ultimately, that's why I wrote that book, Peak.
When you say we invested in culture, maybe can you be more specific? I think every business leader would love to have a
Yeah.
wonderful culture, and they're unsure how to get there. So what did it look like to invest in culture?
Well, it meant everything from creating cultural ambassadors. So we had each of our hotels, restaurants, and spas. We would take somebody who is a line level employee, train them over the course of a month, have them do their normal job, but for the next year, they would be what we called the cultural ambassador for their property, which means that we would help them to improve the culture of their property. Maybe it's having a potluck. There's lots of things you can do in a company that have very little cost, but a huge impact. So having a potluck once a month where each of the people in the hotel could bring in their favorite food from their country, because about 60% of our employees were immigrants. As such, they had food from their home country that they wanted to bring in. We would do once a month. We would also have an employee meeting where we would invite some of our customers to come in and tell their stories about why they loved that hotel. Now, this wasn't hard to do because guess what? These are people who are staying in the hotel already. And we just said, listen, you seem to love the hotel. Could you come and spend 10 minutes telling our employees why you love the hotel? So the kinds of things we did, and I wrote about in my book Peak, really weren't that hard. Let me use one more example. We had a weekly meeting of our leadership team. And at the end of our leadership team, we would spend 10 minutes with anybody on the team who wanted to volunteer and bring up the name of an employee in the company who had done something rather miraculous or magical in the last week. And so they'll bring the person up, and then somebody else on the leadership team from a different department would say, I'm going to go say thank you to that employee. So 3 things came out of that recognition process. So number one is the leadership team got to hear stories of things that were going well, which frankly, in bad times, is something we need. Frankly, it's very easy to just get in the loop of all the bad stuff. Secondly, the employee was appreciative that the leadership team was talking about them. But thirdly, and the real magic was the fact that it was somebody from a different department, maybe the head of finance was going to say thank you to a front desk clerk or a front desk host. All of that additional benefit allowed us to have some cross-departmental love. And so everything I've just mentioned, these 3 examples, none of them cost any money, but they all helped culture.
Across all of your business experiences, one of the through lines is appreciation, gratitude, and another is storytelling.
Yeah.
Where does that come from? Where in your background? You clearly care a lot about it. It was in Joie de Vie when you were in your 20s. It's still in your life now, Modern Elder Academy. Where does your love of storytelling, your kind of passion for using storytelling to bring communities together come from?
Funny enough, Will, when I was 24, or actually when I was 25, I spent a year learning screenwriting. And it was just a couple years out of Stanford Business School. And I was starting to think, oh, maybe I wasn't made for business. Maybe I'm supposed to be a creative person. And so I wrote a screenplay. And then I decided to start the hotel company. So the screenplay never went anywhere. But the idea of storytelling has always been interesting to me. I've always been fascinated by Joseph Campbell's hero's journey format. And I deeply believe that it's part of our sort of the DNA of humans to sit around a campfire and tell stories. And so the idea that each of our hotels at Joie de Vivre was based upon a story. At Airbnb, part of my role as the modern elder there was to help the founders to look at how do we tell the story of why home sharing is really important for the world. And then at MEA, it's all about helping people in midlife learn to retell their story, maybe in a new way.
So I want to now move from the Joie de Vie experience to the Airbnb experience. So at Joie de Vie, you end up selling Joie de Vie. You're very successful. You built this incredible hospitality brand where you obsessed over the customer experience, the visitor experience. Then you end up joining Airbnb, which has no control over the visitor experience, or very, very little control over the experience. And it's really more of a marketplace business, more of a technology product than a human product. So what was the motivation for joining Airbnb?
I was curious. I mean, I had zero desire. I didn't even know what Airbnb was when Brian Chesky, the co-founder and CEO, approached me 13 years ago. I mean, Airbnb was a tiny little tech startup in San Francisco. I happened to be in San Francisco. Brian called me and said, how would you like to democratize hospitality? He said that question, even before he introduced himself. And next thing I knew, we were talking about his little company. And he came over and spent 4 hours in my backyard talking to me about it. And I said, okay, I'll join part-time. Within 3 weeks, it was full-time. And they started calling me the modern elder, which I was like, what? What's a modern elder? And they said, well, you're definitely twice the age of the average person here. I was 52 at the time. And they said, but the most important thing to know about a modern elder is that it's someone who's as curious as they are wise. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, wow. I love that. The alchemy of curiosity and wisdom. At the time, I didn't really think about the fact that, wow, I'm joining a tech company. I didn't have any background in tech at all. But what I really appreciated was the hosts on Airbnb were entrepreneurs. And they're entrepreneurs who deeply wanted to help their little business running, a casita in the backyard or a room down the hallway. They wanted to make some extra money doing this. So I became the entrepreneur in residence and really helped the host community around Airbnb globally start to organize and help each other to teach each other how to be better hosts. The part that was really interesting, Will, is when I started, our guest satisfaction wasn't very high. But by the time I left 7.5 years later, the Airbnb's guest satisfaction relative to hotels was about 40% higher than for hotels. And that was partly because we looked at the underlying motivation of hosts. We helped using our technology to help them to understand where could they be better at what they do. And then through our review process, 70% of hosts and guests review each other, whereas in a hotel, it's maybe 2% of guests fill out an online survey. We had a feedback loop that was very fast. And so very proud of it. I mean, it was an amazing experience. And of course, by the time I left, Airbnb was the most valuable hospitality company in the world.
You spoke earlier about your focus on culture at Joie de Vie. Yeah. Tech companies, particularly small tech companies in the early startup phases, are famous for their idiosyncratic, tech cultures. What surprised you most about joining a tech company coming from hospitality?
Well, I mean, just the sheer volume of money that was available, in the hospitality business, it's a tough business. It's a nickels and dimes business. But you get into a tech company that is venture capital funded that's doing pretty well. And all of a sudden, not only the amount of money we have to spend, to pay for salaries, but also we started something at Airbnb called One Airbnb. And One Airbnb was an annual festival, 4 days long, in which we brought people from 22 offices around the world all together to San Francisco for this festival / love fest.
And I'm guessing you didn't put them up at the Phoenix. They
didn't sit at the Phoenix. They stayed in Airbnbs, and it was so remarkable because what it allowed us to do was to just really immerse people into the culture and the mission of Airbnb, and to help them to see that all of these employees were part of a movement. Ultimately, we took that idea and then I took it into something called the Airbnb Open, which was a series of annual festivals that we did with tens of thousands of hosts who would fly into everywhere from Paris to San Francisco to LA for these big festivals. I think, I mean, just the dollars available in the tech business to spend money on both employee initiatives, but also, customer/host initiatives.
They say that creativity loves constraints. So did the dollars available, what did it lead to unfortunate excesses? I mean, I think about another kind of hospitality/tech business, we work, that
Yeah.
had too much money available, and that ended up being probably part of its demise. So how did
Well,
actually having a lot of money hurt you?
I would say, to Brian's credit, Brian was very thoughtful about spending money. So yes, there were times we would do things that I would never have spent money. I mean, like some of the dollars we spent in the early days considering we were not making any money, was shocking to me as somebody who had run his own business, owned his own business, didn't have investors, and if we were losing money, it was coming straight from my pocket. But what I would say that Brian taught me, and again, he was almost half my age, was that if you're on the right path, and the kinds of growth you can have in tech is so much greater than what you can have in bricks and mortar, that the ROI, the return on investment, can be an enormous upside. So, I learned as much from Brian as he did from me.
So Brian Chesky, the founder, one of the co-founders and CEO of Airbnb, is famous for founder mode. So this is a term that he kind of coined about a year or two ago, and really kind of inspired by Steve Jobs and the kind of maniacal focus on product excellence and kind of obsession in the weeds throughout the detail, in the weeds and in the details of a business. And it inspired this kind of generation of startup founders today to not be traditional managers, but to be really incredibly detail oriented. Maybe if you could share an example of Brian's founder mode, and then more broadly, as you're thinking about leadership generally, do you encourage leaders to be in founder mode, or does it only work sometimes?
I think part of the reason that Brian and I got along so well, and we had a mutual respect for sure, but I think partly because I came from the entrepreneurial world, there was a sense with Brian that I knew what founder mode was. And that meant that, there were times when I was going to be at odds with Brian, but I had to actually also respect that Brian had an intuition about the business that came from starting the business. And that intuition at times, people would get, didn't have his intuition, didn't know. And so what is founders mode? I mean, it really is the idea that at any moment you could parachute in to a product meeting or any kind of meeting and try to give some guidance and direction in such a way that it would help people to understand that the founder has a finger on the pulse of what's happening inside the business, as opposed to the more traditional approach, which is you have a bunch of department heads, and as the CEO of the company, Brian is somewhat distanced from what's happening in product meetings or other meetings. The upside in it is that people get to see Brian, or whomever's the founder, hopefully in their brilliance with great feedback. The disadvantage is it can disempower department heads and other leaders. And that was, I would say, an issue that happened in Airbnb and probably still does. Although Brian's a little, even though he's talked about founders mode, he was definitely more in the founders mode when I was there for sure, because it was a smaller company. The other thing you have to be careful of with founders mode is burnout of the founder, because you can't be everywhere. And one of the things that I've also noticed in myself, both how I'm operating the company that I'm now that I've been CEO of until recently, where I just elevated my CMO to be CEO, is that I don't have to be the hero all the time. One of the risks of founder mode is the ego investment or the ego gratification that a founder can get by coming in and constantly saving the day. If you're constantly coming in and saving the day, you're not giving your employees the empowerment to save the day. And therefore, they're going to become more enabled and reliant upon you. And that's frankly not a way to scale a business. So I think founder mode makes sense. Founder mode makes sense in small doses.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. I think there's a certain learned helplessness that can come as well.
Yeah.
Of if it's going to be the CEO or founder who makes every decision, and then the employees say, you know what, I'm going to stop actually bringing my full self, my full intellect to these moments, because I know ultimately it's going to be kicked upstairs for somebody else to decide. So I want to talk about the transition from Airbnb to Modern Elder Academy.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you were coined the Modern Elder inside of Airbnb. You were twice the age probably of the average employee. What did you learn being twice the age of the average employee? What kind of unique strengths and weaknesses did you bring to it? And then how did that inspire you to then start Modern Elder Academy?
Well, what was going on for me was in my 50s, so I was there at Airbnb in my 50s, I was loving my life. My late 40s, I struggled. And I was like, what's going on here? Why is it that I like my 50s so much more? Part of it was because I frankly didn't have the stress of running my boutique hotel company, having had that dot-com bust we talked about at 9/11, but then also having the Great Recession. So I liked that my role at Airbnb was I was running departments, and I had lots and lots of financial oversight. But on one level, I also could go home at night and not have to worry about it. But I think the key thing that I learned at Airbnb was the value of wisdom. Now, I have to say that when Brian said to me after about a month on the job, he said, "We hired you for your knowledge, Chip, but what you brought was your wisdom." I was like, "Wow, okay, that's good." But I came to realize that some of what I considered common sense was wisdom. Because if you've been around a while, you have built some awareness. So I define wisdom as metabolized experience, mindfully shared for the common good. Metabolized experience means you have life lessons that you've learned. And so for me at Airbnb, what I saw was there were a lot of people who wanted me to mentor them. And I didn't have a shingle out that said, like Lucy and Charlie Brown, like 10 cents advice. But people came to me and said, like, I really want some advice from you, and I really like to tap into your wisdom. And so what I got to see was this idea of intergenerational collaborations. We had 5 generations in the workplace for the first time. And by the year 2027, the majority of Americans will have a younger boss. So long story short is that there's a real need for us to develop mutual mentorship across generations. And the mentorship is not always from old to young. It can go in both directions. But in the era of AI, where knowledge has become a commodity, maybe it's time for wisdom to make a comeback. And part of the reason that I started MEA, the Modern Elder Academy, is I wanted to create the world's first midlife wisdom school that was not focusing on accumulating knowledge, but instead was focusing on helping people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s distill their wisdom. How do you make sense of your life lessons in such a way that it makes you wiser and maybe even your leadership team wiser? And let me use an example of that. Once a quarter, back in the Joie de Vivre era at Airbnb and at MEA, I've had a practice. It's a wisdom management practice, which is the leadership team sits around and once a quarter says, what was your biggest lesson of the quarter? And each of the people will tell their lesson and they'll say, how will it serve you in the future? How will it serve me in the future? So what's my biggest lesson of the quarter? How will it serve me in the future? So we all, in essence, have to have the vulnerability and candor to talk about that, but we all learn each other's lessons. I mean, the COO tells me her lessons and I say like, wow, that's a good one. Now maybe I don't have to make that mistake like you did, and I can be wiser for it. And then we end the meeting with the question of what's our biggest team lesson of the quarter, and we talk about that. So wisdom is a really important piece of being a great leader, but it has not gotten the attention that it deserves.
I think your line defining what wisdom is wonderful. I'm gonna remember that and internalize it. So we've talked around Modern Elder Academy. We brought it up, but maybe just say directly for the audience, what is Modern Elder Academy and how?
Yeah,
what is Modern Elder Academy?
We have 2 campuses, one in Santa Fe, New Mexico on a 4 square mile regenerative horse ranch, and then one in Baja in Mexico on the beach. And people come for, a few days. It's like usually 3, 4, or 5 day program. And they learn how to navigate the transitions of midlife, how to cultivate purpose, how to learn, how to, own their wisdom, and how to reframe their relationship with aging and longevity. So it is called, the New York Times called it the world's first midlife wisdom school. And we have 7,500 alumni now from 60 countries and 56 regional chapters around the world. And we have online programs as well.
What is the hardest part about the transition to midlife that people attending are confronting?
One of the hardest things is that when you're in midlife, you're going through all kinds of transitions. And frankly, you like if you're going through transitions in adolescence as a teenager, you just know that's par for the course. But for a lot of people in midlife, and midlife again defined mostly as 40s, 50s, and 60s, in midlife, if you're going through transitions, you sort of feel like you're getting the game of life wrong. Or so if like, I think that's one issue. A second issue is people get overwhelmed with obligations. We accumulate all kinds of things. And by the time you hit 45 or 50, you're sort of like you don't have much time for anything but all of the obligations. And so learning how to let go of some of the identities, and we call it the great midlife edit at MEA, helping people to edit their life so they realize what are the things they need to let go of in order to create more space in their life to try something new.
I've also heard you say that the primary operating system for the first half of our life is our ego, and then we move to be driven by our soul, which I think is a really powerful idea and image.
Yeah, that comes from Richard Rohr even. Richard Rohr, the famous Catholic priest and mystic, is on our faculty and actually, in fact, is based here in New Mexico. So the premise of that is that, the first half of our life, we're striving. We strive, to try to attain and try to, be the best we can be, but also, sometimes for ego purposes. And often around midlife, a lot of people actually sometimes have challenging circumstances come up. We call it the midlife crisis. I now call it the midlife chrysalis because it's often a transformative era. It is an era in which people sometimes feel the need to connect with something deeper in themselves, and maybe even something more spiritual or religious in their life as well.
I'm actually curious, in your experience and background, you have touched on spirituality and you've touched on connection. What is your own kind of spiritual or religious North Star?
I grew up Episcopalian, but very, very lightly. We didn't go to church all that often. But I was on the board of Glide Memorial Church, a Methodist church, a Liberation Theology church, primarily African American church in the Tenderloin of San Francisco. So you could call me a little bit Methodist, but also a little bit Buddhist because I'm a boo meth, because I have done a whole lot of silent meditation retreats at Buddhist retreat centers and have studied Buddhism probably more than any other religion. And so that's where it comes from. But I deeply believe that all of the world's religions have the same message, which is
same source material they're pulling from.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So you brought up Richard Rohr, one of the luminaries that has come to Modern Elder Academy. I think one of the things that I find very interesting and exciting about MEA is that you're able to bring in these exceptional luminaries that help guide programs. I want to ask you about a few of them and the kind of key lesson that they have taught you. So the first is Elizabeth Gilbert, the author of Eat, Pray, Love and Big Magic, who's one of your luminaries. What's the key lesson she's taught you in life?
She's taught me that you can constantly evolve in your identity, and her most recent book is sort of the evidence of that. So that the idea that you can let go of an identity is part of what we're supposed to do, just like snakes molt their skin.
Another author, Anne Lamott, another one of your luminaries.
Anne Lamott is, she's a left-wing Christian, which is unusual in America today. And she deeply believes in her religious faith, but she does so as an activist. So I think of her as being someone who takes her faith very seriously in a social justice kind of way.
Very rarely are Anne Lamott and Ricky Williams going to be brought up back to back, but my final one for you is Ricky Williams, the former star running back, is one of your luminaries as well. So what's the kind of key lessons you've learned from Ricky?
He won the Heisman Trophy and was a very well-known football running back, and he's now called Eric Miron. So speaking of evolving identities and evolving names, I think the thing that's really interesting about him is how playful he is, how he has a playful spirit around the idea that in midlife, why shouldn't we be playing? And so I find him to be a delightful human being.
Wonderful. So before we move into the lightning round, final question for you. You're a prolific author. You brought up Peak, one of your books earlier. You recently published a book about this kind of midlife journey, the chrysalis, as you called it earlier. You also wrote a book about emotional equations.
Yeah.
And I would love if you could just introduce the concept of emotional equations to this audience, and maybe to introduce it, pick one emotional equation that has really kind of guided you in your path.
Yeah, so emotional equations came from my studying of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, in which I tried to distill the message of that down to one equation, which was despair equals suffering minus meaning. And in essence, despair and meaning are inversely proportional. But let me use a different one to get this point across. And men love this book. It became a New York Times bestseller, and it's partly because there's a lot of logic built into it in terms of understanding the ingredients or the recipe of a particular emotion. Anxiety equals uncertainty times powerlessness. So there are two primary ingredients of when you feel anxious about something. It's when you feel uncertain about something or powerless about it. So you don't know or you can't control. And so the way to solve for that is to create an anxiety balance sheet, which is think about the thing you're really anxious about right now. What do I know? What don't I know? What can I influence? What can't I influence? When you put that down on paper, people often feel less anxious, partly because they realize, yes, there's certain things they don't know and certain things they can't control, but actually there are a lot of things they do know, and there are a lot of things they can influence. And so just, the book became a big hit.
Well, I thought it was a fascinating concept. It's a great cover as well. For those who are listening, go check out the cover of it, the equations, but I would highly recommend it to all of our listeners. So I want to move into our lightning round, a few quick questions that I'd love to get your view on. You seem to be a real movie buff, and you host screenings at the Modern Elder Academy. What is a movie that everybody listening should go and watch this weekend?
Well, yeah, you would have to go ahead and stream it. It's called I'll Push You. It's about the Camino de Santiago, the pilgrimage that happens 400, 500 miles across northern Spain. And it's the story of it's a story of friendship, midlife friendship, and two men who are good friends, and one of them has a neurodegenerative disease and is in a wheelchair, and his best friend pushes him in a wheelchair on the Camino for 400 or 500 miles. It's a beautiful friendship story.
Wow. Yeah, sounds beautiful. Second, as I mentioned earlier, you are a prolific author yourself. What is a book that you didn't write that you find yourself recommending often?
Well, I'll just go back to Man's Search for Meaning. I think it's a great leadership book because it really speaks to this idea of, in the worst of circumstances, how do you conduct yourself? How do you find meaning, at the bottom of a recession? How do you find meaning when you're laying people off? How do you find meaning in all kinds of other ways? So I consider it to be the best leadership book ever written.
Absolutely. Well, in Stephen Covey's 7 Habits, the first habit, be proactive, he talks about man's search for meaning, and there's a space between action and reaction, and in that space is where we derive meaning. So we certainly agree in the importance of that book. The third and final lightning round question: let's say you had a billboard that every leader in America drove past. What would you write on that billboard?
Be yourself, everyone else is taken.
That's a great one. Well, it seems like that is a lesson that you certainly have taken,
Yes.
which is wonderful. So to close out, the same question we asked to all of our guests, FranklinCovey is a leadership company. I would love to hear about a leader who has greatly influenced you, and what lesson can all of us learn from them?
I'm going to give you two. So the first one was Herb Kelleher. So Herb Kelleher, for 37 years, was the CEO of Southwest Airlines. And boy, did he invest in culture. And when I was 34 years old, and at the point I had 5 hotels already, I actually called Dallas looking for Herb Kelleher, and because I wanted him to be my mentor. And his assistant, Colleen Barrett, said, well, he's a little busy, but why don't you write him a letter and ask him these leadership questions, these culture questions you have. And he responded. 3 weeks later, I got a letter back. This is before email. And long story short is he basically gave me answers to each of my questions. And he said, I loved your questions. Once a year, you can write me. And so for the next 10 years, I would write him a letter. We didn't get email. I would write him a letter, and he would respond. And so he became my librarian. I called him my mentor from afar, my librarian, because he had the know-how and know who. The other one I'm going to use is a guy named Buzz McCoy. When I was at Morgan Stanley between my first and second year of business school, Buzz really recruited me to come work for him for the summer. He really wanted me to come back after business school. He really cared a lot about me. But he was also a mentor, but he was a mentor, not the librarian who had all the know-how and know-who, but he was a mentor of somebody who was my confidant. He had confidence in me. And the thing I loved about him was, ultimately I did not go back to work for him at Morgan Stanley. And when I told him all of the reasons I was going to take this job with a real estate developer in San Francisco, even though his job was really to try to persuade me to go work for Morgan Stanley, he treated me like a best friend and said, listen, I can see the reasons why you want to do this, and I think it's the right path. And I want you to consider me to be a mentor from here forward. So long story short is I love that guy.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for sharing your incredible wisdom today with our audience. You have such an impressive and far-ranging career, and you really have taken from all that and metabolized the experience as you shared earlier. So thank you so much for the time.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And for all of our guests, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. For all of our listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. And please join us next week for another episode of FranklinCovey on Leadership.